Hey, what's up? John Sonmez from simpleprogrammer.com. So I got a question here about Agile software development. Actually, I've got a few questions, so I thought I would summarize the questions by answering it, or by merging it into one simplified question, which is, what is Agile software development? Or, John, could you tell me what Agile means, what Agile software development is? So, this is such a complicated question, yet so simple. So I think there's a lot of confusion about Agile software development because Agile is really amorphous, right? What I mean by that is that it doesn't really mean anything by itself. There's so many different ways that people interpret what Agile means in Agile software development. I've done quite a few blog posts on Agile software development. You can check out here. Should be a link for how to build Agile software, and it's got quite a few links there. Some of them are a little bit dated, but that can kind of give you an idea of what Agile development is and how to do Agile development. But I'm going to give you sort of my definition of Agile development, and different people will disagree. But I think it's a useful model to look at, the world of software development. So let's talk about what came before Agile and kind of development processes and history. So mostly before people started doing Agile development, before it became popular, there was a development process known as waterfall. Now, it wasn't called waterfall, right? For those of you that are history buffs, developer history buffs, in general, right? There's some papers, some references why I got the waterfall name. We're not going to get into all of that, but essentially what happened was that there was a development process that followed the software development life cycle, which basically went through the different phases from analysis, coming up with the problem, gathering requirements, to doing design, right, to implementation, writing the code, to testing, and then to deployment, release, maintenance. Different people make different steps out of those, but essentially that order with very small overlaps, right? So if you had a software development project in the past, mostly, not everyone followed this, but mostly the general way that it was done, and still it's done a lot of places, honestly, this way, is that basically you come up with a project timeline and you figure out how long these different phases are going to take, and you plan on being in those phases during that time. So for example, you might have like a 6-month project, or let's say a year project, and you say, okay, well, it'll take a couple of months to do the requirements gathering and analysis, and then we're going to spend another couple of months doing design, and then it should take us 3 months to implement it, and then 1 month to test it, and then and you make your project, use Microsoft Project to plan out all these activities, and hopefully it all works together. But what ends up happening is, majority of the time, 90% of the software development projects, they run late, because it's really hard to plan these things out, right? Because you don't know what's going to happen, and a lot of times you end up bouncing between phases, right? So you end up saying, oh, well, wait, we're not quite ready for test. I thought we were ready for test, but there's like a feature change. The customer wants this, or this didn't work out right, or you implement the wrong thing. So you're back to designing and analysis, and maybe back to re-implementing it and testing it again. So Agile sort of developed out of a lot of different threads, right? So there was a bunch of smart people that were sort of on their own and kind of collaborating and figuring out there's got to be a better way. We need to come up with some methodologies and processes, and some of these things happen in silos. You've got Kent Beck, who invented extreme programming, and I think that was like early 90s really when it started. And then you've got people like Bob Martin, who did a lot of experimentation with different processes. You've got a few other processes. You've got Ken Schwaber, who invented Scrum with Jeff Sutherland, and they basically came up with a system of developing iteratively, right? And there were a bunch of other pioneers and people in the development community that figured out basically this simple idea, which was that doing this waterfall step down type of model, it doesn't really work, because because of a lot of limitations. One of them just being the time, right? That you can't plan a project very well that way. And two, because it always slips, right? And then secondly, that in the real world, like you can't go through requirements and gather all the requirements for a project because it changes, right? These pesky customers, they change their mind all the time. This stuff changes, right? And so that's frustrating. And when you're on a project that has a fixed budget and a fixed timeline, and you've got to go from phase to phase, and someone wants to change their mind, or you didn't gather, what you find out is you didn't gather all the requirements because no one knew, because you can't know until you actually see something, and then you're like, that's not right? And so it really throws a wrench into a waterfall type of methodology, right? So all these guys kind of figured this out, and they basically figured out, okay, we need some kind of an iterative model. And that's what, so Agile is really iterative, right? This is really the big difference here. So what is an iterative model? There's lots of different variations of this. There was, historically the spiral model, which was more like mini waterfall. I've got a blog post on don't go chasing waterfalls, and talk about mini waterfalls and why that's not really agile. And that's kind of what spiral was, which is basically taking waterfall and just slicing it up. So instead of just doing one big year-long project with those 6 phases or whatever in there, you're going to slice it up and do those 6 phases every month or so. And that's a better approach, right? But it's still not what I call quote agile and iterative. So what happened? Basically, we had these different methodologies, and they figured out that what makes the most sense is to iteratively develop, to evolve the software. So basically, you come out with some version of the software, and if you can put it in front of the customer, that's great. And then they suggest some features, or they say, oh, I don't quite like that. And then you make changes and you add more features, and you're evolving it. And the whole time that you're making the software, you're kind of showing it to the customer, right? Or you're at least testing it. Like, you're going through the whole thing. You're not doing this whole big upfront requirements gathering, this whole big upfront design, implementing all this stuff, and then trying to test it all and finding it's all wrong, right? Instead, you're doing this in little pieces, and you're valuing feedback. So what ended up happening was a bunch of these guys got together. I think it was like the Snowbird Resort in Utah. You'll have to excuse me. I don't have any notes, and I'm not looking any of this up, so I'm just kind of spitballing this from memory. But essentially, I think might have been 17 of them. There's some people you recognize, like Bob Martin and Kent Beck and whatnot, that were there, and Alistair Cockburn, I think. I'm trying to think of some of the other ones. Dave Thomas. I don't know. It was a lot, right? And then a lot of these guys actually became kind of famous for this, but they got together and they developed what is called the Agile Manifesto, right? I'll put a link here. You can check out the Agile Manifesto. It's still up, and what they basically did is they just came together and said, okay, what can we agree on and what's important? And what they ended up doing was forming what really became Agile, which was basically this idea, that this unspoken idea, first of all, that it has to be iterative development. but in some way, when you hear about the values, and you can read the Agile Manifesto, I'm just going to give you kind of the cliff notes of it. Basically, it was like, okay, we're going to embrace change, like Kent Beck said in Extreme Programming, right? And what we're going to do is we're going to value change, right? We're going to just assume that in the software development project that the requirements are going to change, and we're going to develop all of our processes, everything around it, expecting change and being able to deal with change, instead of being, the stupid end of it where you're doing waterfall and you're like thinking that things aren't going to change. Like, that's not reality. Let's face reality, right? I always talk about facing reality. Okay, so, and then they said, okay, we're going to value people over processes, right? Which makes sense, because sometimes you'd get into these software development projects and you'd have like fill out this rec form, and there's so much paperwork and so much data and so much documentation. It was like, no, let's just if I could just go over and communicate to you, like if we could sit together, maybe we could work on this together, we could just solve this problem. We don't need to file 500 bug reports and file all this paperwork, right? So they valued people over processes, and valued working software over documentation, right? Again, like, do we really need to document all this stuff? Let's just create the software, and the software speaks for itself. This is ultimately what we're trying to do. So they tried to cut out a lot of the cruft, a lot of this stuff. And so that's really the heart of Agile, right? So Now, Agile's kind of been perverted in some ways. It's been, kind of twisted. A lot of consultants make a lot of money doing Agile coaching. I understand that. I do some Agile coaching myself, but probably a lot differently than what you might expect. Anyway, out into the scene comes Scrum, okay? This is actually more of the story of it. But in order to understand Agile, you have to understand the story of Agile to some degree. So Scrum gained a lot of steam. It's a really good system. It has its flaws. I've done some blog posts on Scrum. You can definitely check that out. But basically, it ended up kind of defining itself as Agile in most people's minds. So I think most people, when they think of Agile, they think of a stand-up meeting, 10-minute stand-up meeting every day, where you say, what you worked on yesterday, what you're working on today, and any impediments that you have. And that's a part of Scrum, and Scrum is a good process. We're not going to go, maybe I'll do a video. If you're interested in me doing a video on Scrum, I can do a video on Scrum. But basically, Scrum is Agile, but Agile isn't Scrum, even though a lot of people think it is. What I mean by that is that Scrum followed properly is in the spirit of the Agile development, right? And so what is the whole point to all of this? What is Agile again? To answer that question is very difficult, but essentially Agile development really is just, it's really defined us by the Agile manifesto. It's any development process that's an iterative development process that's kind of part of this movement. Again, people can debate and argue what is Agile and what's the best way to do Agile, but basically where you are getting rapid feedback, where you're having short feedback cycles, right? Iterations, if you want to call them, sprints, whatever you want to call them, and you're getting feedback from the customer or the stakeholder, and you're making those changes, right, as quickly as possible. You're evolving the software. That's the whole point of Agile development, is to be Agile, where you don't have a whole bunch of burdensome process documentation and all this stuff. It doesn't mean that you don't have any documentation. It just means that you're cutting through the cruft and trying to really just get to the point of evolving and developing the software and taking the feedback into account as you're developing it. To me, right, again, this is my opinion of my definition of Agile, because it's so, the definition is so elusive and can be interpreted in so many ways. That is it, right? That's the core essential things. If you're doing that, whatever you're doing, if you're doing Kanban, if you're doing Scrum, if you're doing Scrumban or some kind of combination, or just some process that you don't have named, that's Agile development, right? It's not necessarily what someone tries to sell you as Agile development. And the process is only as good, Agile development is only as good as the people and the processes that implement it, right? So I want to stress that. It's not a magic bullet. It's not, quote, better than waterfall. It can be if it's applied correctly, but I've seen some waterfall teams that have really good processes that do things really well and exceed some Agile teams. So there's, especially, in some places too, we should wrap this up, but in some places waterfall does make more sense, because if you have hardware that can't change, that you've got to design that up front, right? Because it's not easy to change. Now it's easier to change hardware than it used to be, but back then it makes sense, right? And there's still some situations where you've got to be very specific, and you got to plan everything and test everything out up front. Some of them could be mission critical medical software or avionics, where lives are at stake, where you can't have bugs, and you've got to have things decided and specified up front, or expensive manufacturing process that relies on some of this design. So anyway, don't want to go down that rabbit trail, but that's Agile. If you have any questions, if you have some comments, if you've got some good definitions to add to this, leave a comment below. And as always, I'd like to remind you that you can get these videos every day, because I produce what do I do? 2-3 videos a day for the most part. All you gotta do is click the subscribe button. So if you haven't already, definitely click it. And if you'd like to join the Simple Programmer community, which is pretty awesome, I've got a Facebook group. There's a lot of really cool perks. If you're getting value out of these videos, you'd like to support, the videos and join the community, check out the Patreon campaign. It's pretty cool. I think it's a good addition, and I've been having a lot of fun doing Patreon only stuff, so anyway, that's all I got for you today. I will talk to you next time. Take care.